If you're wanting to get started and learn video in 2025, then this is the right video for you, because in this video, I'm going to explain the scary 3-step exposure triangle and make it super easy and super simple. I know switching into manual mode and trying to figure out ISO, aperture, and shutter speed can seem like a daunting task, but I'm gonna break it down in this video and make it very simple. And with practice, you're gonna get this in no time. So let's jump in and talk about how to get proper exposure when you're shooting video. First up, let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed to me is one of the biggest differences that you have to think about from a different angle when you're doing photo compared to video. So with video, when you think shutter speed, you want to think motion blur. The most commonly used rule for shutter speed when you're doing video is that your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. And your frame rate is just how many frames per second, FPS, that your camera captures when it's doing video. The most common being 24 frames per second, just to give that real life look. So if you were shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed would need to be 1/48, because that would be double your frame rate. And if your camera doesn't have an exact 1/48, you can always do 1/50, the closest one. Now, what this double your frame rate rule does is it allows the motion blur to look like it would in person. So if you wave your hand and you wave it in front of your face, you can see that there's some motion blur. Like, it's not, every single thing isn't clear in person when I'm looking at my hand move. So I'm actually going to change the shutter speed on my camera and show you exactly what this does. So we'll start out with how it's set right now, which is 1/50 because I'm shooting in 24 frames. So this is what it looks like shooting at 1/50 shutter speed. This is going to look the most natural. This is going to be how we perceive things in real life, how motion blur should look. Now, this is with a shutter speed of 1/125. So this is going to be faster, it's going to capture the motion more and kind of make it look a little bit more sticky, not as blurry, not as much motion blur going on. And you should also keep in mind that the more that you increase your shutter speed, the darker your image will become. Now this is with the shutter speed set to 1/320. You can see that this definitely gives an entirely different look. It's much more crispy. Almost every motion that I make is a lot more captured, not as blurry as it is when it's at 1/50. And this is what it would look like if you dropped your shutter speed to 1/15. So this is too slow, and this gives it almost like a seasick feeling. There's too much motion blur. You don't actually see this much motion blur in real life. So you could use a slow shutter speed like this for a certain effect if that's what you were going for. The same way you can use a faster shutter speed to capture that motion depending on what you might need for your video. But just as a general rule, normally you can set your shutter speed at double your frame rate, and that's going to give you the most natural motion blur. We're back at 1/50, and that's going to look the best on most occasions, again, depending on what you're shooting. Now, let's talk about ISO. ISO basically just represents how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. And the easiest way to think about ISO in my mind is to think about digitally turning up the brightness of your image. So basically like adding fake light. You're brightening the image, but you're doing it in a completely digital way. And the main thing to remember with ISO is the higher your ISO is, the more noise and grain it will introduce into your image. And I'll show you an example of this, but first, let's talk about native ISO or base ISO. Every camera has a base ISO or a native ISO, and this is basically the ISO that the camera doesn't have to really do any digital work. So this is going to be the cleanest image that it can produce when you're shooting in, for example, S-Log3, like I'm shooting on my Sony camera. I'm shooting in S-Log3 on the Sony a7C II, so the base ISO is 800 for shooting in S-Log3. So basically it just means it's that sweet spot where the image is going to be the cleanest. And some cameras have dual native ISOs. So there might be one like an 800, and then there might be one that's like 12,800 or 3,200, where as you go up, the noise will increase, but once you hit that second native ISO, it will clean up the image again. So let's see an example of this. This is the Sony a7C II. I'm shooting in S-Log3, so I have my ISO set at 800, that base ISO. And let's just see what happens as we increase the ISO. This is at ISO 1000. 1250, 1600, 2000, 2500, 3200, and this is the second dual native ISO, so you should see the image clean up just a little. And now as we increase, it should start to get noisy again. 4000, 5000, 6400, 8000, 10,000, and this is 12,800. And on some Sony cameras, this is actually the second dual native ISO, like it is on my FX3. So the image would clean up at 12,800, but on this camera, it's at 3,200, so it doesn't clean up at 12,800. And as you can see, this is really noisy the higher you increase your ISO. You should be able to really tell in darker parts of your image because that's where the noise will be more noticeable. So whenever possible, you don't want to have your ISO this high. So hopefully that was a good example of ISO and what it really does to your image. There are definitely instances when you're shooting and you need to be able to just bump up, have a little bit more light, and you can always do that, but just remember the more that you bump your ISO, the more noise that it will add to your image. Unless you can reach your second dual native ISO if you have one on your camera. But for the cleanest image, you want to make sure you're shooting at the native ISO or base ISO for your camera, which is something that you can look up on Google. Okay, we've talked about shutter speed, we've talked about ISO. Now let's talk about the third and final part, which is aperture. To do this, I'm gonna switch lenses real quick. Okay, this is gonna be a little bit of a tighter shot because I'm having to use an 85mm because I really want to demonstrate aperture and what it can do. So when you think aperture, you need to think depth of field. And what depth of field is basically what section of your image is in focus. So you can think blurry background when you think aperture and think depth of field. And technically, aperture is how opened or closed the iris of your lens is. I have this old vintage lens that I'll demonstrate so that you can see the aperture blades and how they open and close. So you can see that the aperture blades open and close, and that is what affects your depth of field and how blurry or how in focus the background of your image is. Aperture also affects how much light is let through the lens into your camera sensor, so it's also going to affect the brightness and darkness of your image. The more you close down the aperture rings, the more in focus your image will be, the darker it will be because there's a smaller hole. The more you open the aperture, the more light it's going to let in, and also the blurrier the background will be. And different lenses can shoot at different apertures. And you'll be able to tell this because on the lens, it will tell you f2.8, f1.4, f1.8. And that f number is just a measurement of how much light it can let in at its most open point, if that makes sense. So right now with this lens, I'm shooting at an f1.4. And as you can see, this gives an extremely shallow depth of field, which means that only like this much of the image is in focus and everything else behind me is blurry. So let's compare different aperture settings so that you can really see what this does and how it affects your image. This is f1.4. This is f1.8. This is f2.8. This is f4. And this is f9. And I could keep going. But you can definitely see as we continue to go up, the background becomes more in focus. And you're probably like, okay, well, which aperture do I choose? And that completely depends on what you're shooting. If you're wanting to do something that has a really blurry background, like a portrait or talking head like this, where you really want the background to be creamy, then you're gonna want a low aperture. But if you're shooting a landscape, for example, then you probably want the whole scene in focus, so you would use a higher aperture. The most common aperture, especially for zoom lenses, is gonna be an f2.8. And that's what I've been shooting the whole rest of this video on. But there are moments when you would want something like this nice f1.4 to get that super creamy background that you just can't get with an f2.8. And most of the time, you would have to get a prime lens to do that, which is a lens that doesn't zoom, it's only one focal length, like this 85 I'm using right now. But that was just a quick explanation of aperture and how it works. And that was just a quick overview of the three main settings of manual mode, or what we call the exposure triangle, to make up the total brightness or exposure of your image when you're shooting video. I know it can seem overwhelming, and once you get in a real life scenario, you're like, oh, do I change my shutter speed? Do I change the aperture? Do I change the ISO? What do I do? But if you practice these settings, think about them in simple terms: shutter speed, motion blur; aperture, blurry background, depth of field; ISO, adding in fake light, camera's sensitivity to light; and you think about it in these easy terms, the more you do it, the more you practice, you will eventually become a pro and be able to do it without even thinking. And once you master these settings, I promise it will level up the quality of your video, because going from shooting in auto or an automatic mode where the camera does a lot of the settings for you to shooting in manual mode is definitely going to improve the quality, because then it gives the control into your hands and it's not just the camera guessing. It gives you control over your settings and how your final product looks. So if you're wanting to do some cool slow shutter with some motion blur stuff going on, then you know how to do that, because you can change your shutter speed settings and then adjust all of your other settings to compensate for the brightness, and etc, etc. Once you learn how to do that, you'll be able to use all of these settings in any scenario that you find yourself in. Anyway, hopefully you found some value in this video, and if you did, be sure to check out some of the other videos on my channel.